So I take it that I am not the only one who, upon waking up this past Thursday morning, wondered to myself, how is it already May? And that it was time to once again do all of the new beginning of the month routines. And here for us, that means we have a new spiritual theme, that we're going into another one of our church values, our values that we've been exploring since January. Back in January, we began with joy, before moving to compassion and wholeheartedness, and last month, openness to awe. And now, merrily, we roll along down the stream onto our next value, equity and inclusion. Equity and inclusion. I'll just say that as I was preparing for this week, I've kept going back to one of the very first conversations that I had with Reverend Wendy when I first got here about preaching. My first sermon here was also on the first Sunday of a month, and that meant that we were also starting a theme. And we were talking about how do you write a sermon when you're kicking off a theme, especially on these first Sundays of the months, as so many of our churches do monthly themes. And Reverend Wendy, recognizing my overachiever inclinations, she cautioned me against this tendency that many of us UU preachers have on that first Sunday, a temptation to try to say every single thing that there is to say about the theme, even though there are at least 3 more Sundays. And that caution, it activated some pouty little toddler part of my brain, and I thought to myself, with no small amount of irony given our current theme, but I want to include everything. I want to include everything. Thankfully, I had the good sense not to blurt that out to our esteemed senior minister. And while we probably shouldn't listen to that voice, that impulse to include everything in sermons or other presentations, we should always listen to a similar impulse. The similar impulse to include everyone, And that impulse, the impulse to include everyone, that impulse is one that is very much a part of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. As UUs, we are a people. We are a people who want to include everyone because our theology says that everyone has dignity and everyone belongs. And so we do a lot of signaling to show others, especially newcomers, that we want to welcome them into our spaces. So many of our congregations, for example, we include in our worship services some kind of welcome message or statement like that one that Emily alluded to earlier. A statement about our desire to welcome all people, especially those with marginalized identities. A common one says this: whoever you are, whomever you love, wherever you are on your life journey, whatever the color of your skin or your country of origin, whatever your gender or the source of your faith, you are welcome here. Sound familiar to anyone? Yeah, that's the one my home congregation uses. We are a people who want to honor our Universalist heritage by including everyone, especially people who've been excluded from religious communities. And so we eagerly tell newcomers, whoever you are, whatever your collection of identities, you are welcome here. We have made a place for you. We're not just making a place for you. We've already done it. It's ready. Come on, join us. Now, you all probably know me well enough by now to know that I am constitutionally incapable of leaving well enough alone or letting the status quo sit as it is. As I said, either you're welcome or I'm really sorry. And so you might suspect that I'm about to complicate this kind of welcome statement. And if you do, congrats. Because here's the thing. As much as I love the sentiment behind these kinds of welcome statements, and I do love it, I knew, as Emily did, that I had found my spiritual home when I first walked into UU Church and heard that. As much as I love the sentiment behind these kinds of welcome statements, I also really struggle with them. I have a really hard time with these kinds of blanket, confident welcome statements because I have witnessed too many instances when our actions have undermined those very important words. You see, I've been in congregations where we UUs have said, whatever your gender, you are welcome here. only to hear trans people persistently misgendered, that is, addressed by the wrong name, referred to by the wrong pronouns, or labeled with a gender other than their own. Oh, you're such a fine young man, people might say, when you do not identify that way. And this misgendering, it hasn't just been in passing conversations. It's been by staff and from the pulpit. I've also been in UU congregations where we have said, whatever your race or the color of your skin, you are welcome here, only to hear white UUs make harmful statements about race and anti-racism work, and in the worst moments, even communities of color. And I've been in congregations where we UUs have said, whatever your financial means, whatever your socioeconomic status, you are welcome here, only to witness before my very eyes ushers trying to escort out a neighbor of the church, an unemployed neighbor who had come to the church to ask for assistance with getting a bus ticket and some groceries to feed her infant grandson. Which means that her only transgression was turning to the church for what has always been a core function of religious communities, helping those in need. I'll note that in that last instance, staff did intervene and she did get assistance. But in each of these cases, in all of these cases, the congregation's words might have said one thing, but the congregation's actions said something very, very different. Now, our UU communities are, of course, not the only ones who have fallen short of our promises of including all people. In that powerful time for all ages we heard today from Sarah, we heard a wonderful example of a group of people calling attention to our country's overall failure to include disabled folks. That group of activists who called on our country to make amends for those failures by passing the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. But one part of that story that we didn't hear earlier is that young activist that Sarah introduced us to, 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan Chaffins. As Jennifer crawled out of her wheelchair and up the 83 hard marble steps of the US Capitol building in over 80-degree heat, she carried in her pocket, as did every single one of those activists, not just a pamphlet about why the ADA needed to be passed, but also a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And when the activists, when they finally reached the top of those stairs, volunteers took those documents and they ran them to the offices of key members of Congress. And the message was clear. Our country may have promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all people, but it had not made good on that promise for people with disabilities. The message that was that in order for our country to make good on those promises for disabled Americans, we needed to make some changes. We needed to redesign our physical infrastructure, and we needed laws that would require institutions to do that. And more generally, that Capitol crawl protest, it also reminded all those who witnessed it that when it comes to equity and inclusion, it is not the comparatively easy work of believing and saying the right things that matters most. But rather, what matters most when it comes to equity inclusion is a much more difficult work of living into the things that we say, of living into the promises we make. What matters most is recognizing the ways that we need to change our institutions and our ways of gathering in order to better include all who desire to belong to them. And then we need to turn that recognition into action by making those changes. Those of you who've been around for a while, you might notice a parallel between the message sent by using that Declaration of Independence in that protest and the movement that led to our UU Face 8th principle. As you've heard me say before from this pulpit, in that movement, BIPOC UUs, that's UUs who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, they pointed to our existing UU principles, those principles which celebrated, among other things, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And BIPOC UUs, they told white UUs a difficult truth. The truth that our faith had not lived into its principles or made good on its promises of equity and inclusion when it came to welcoming BIPOC members fully into our spaces. BIPOC UUs, they drew attention to that painful reality that in spite of UU's many declarations that everyone is welcome here, no matter the color of your skin, they didn't experience that welcome, at least not all the time. And to the great credit of white folks in this congregation and hundreds of others across the country who adopted that eighth principle, we white UUs admitted that BIPOC UUs were right. Our whole community, our whole JUC community, white and BIPOC together, our whole community adopted that covenantal commitment which says, yes, there's racism. There is racism in ourselves and our institutions. We're not an exception to it, but we will work to dismantle it. We will work to dismantle it together. This kind of confession of past wrongdoings, it's a huge part of the practice and the work of our value of equity and inclusion. You see, there's something about equity and inclusion that we often overlook because it's almost too obvious. And that thing that we overlook is that in saying that we value the work of equity and inclusion, we acknowledge that at least on some level, we live in a world where that work is desperately needed. We live in a world in which equity and inclusion are not yet fully realized. And so to commit to the work of equity and inclusion, it implies that the current state of affairs is marked by at least some level of inequity and exclusion. And in committing to do that work, we commit to undo as much of those harms as we can. But the first step, as is so often the case, is acknowledging, honestly and specifically, the ways in which we have fallen short of being truly welcoming and inclusive. The social work of equity and inclusion calls on us both individually and collectively to a type of spiritual work, to the spiritual work of repair, to the spiritual work of confessing our past mistakes, and the spiritual work of working to make amends and to mend relationships. And if we're being honest, this kind of confession, it hasn't always been our strong suit as UUs. I suspect that that's partly because of our belief that humans are ultimately good, not sinful, that we would rather focus on the good that humans have and could do rather than the harm that we've caused. But I also suspect that part of why we struggle so much with confession, with admitting our past mistakes, is nothing more to do than with a collective ego and a sense of self-image of having always been right. We have a hard time admitting that we have ever been on the wrong side of history. We talk about the fact that a quarter of our ministers participated in the 1965 Selma March. What we don't talk about is that just 2 years prior to that, our congregations voted democratically against a resolution which would have expressed our denomination's support for nonviolent resistance to Jim Crow. Our congregations chose collectively not to pass that resolution. And here at JUC, which was at the time just a few years old, a full 1/3 of the members of this congregation voted against that resolution. A full 1/3 of our members in 1963, at the height of the civil rights movement, a full 1/3 voted against that resolution which would have expressed our public support to the ongoing nonviolent resistance to Jim Crow that was taking place in the American South. A full 1/3. This brings us to that song that Juice played for us as our offertory today. That song by Tracy Chapman, the singer-songwriter and queer Black prophet. I love that song. I love that song. I love that song not just because my dad had it on CD. We do remember CDs, right, folks? And he used to play that CD as he drove my twin and I around Pittsburgh when we were kiddos, although that's certainly a part of why I love it. But I love that song also because in its own way, it is so deeply theological. And it gives us a beautiful example of how to do this hard work of confessing and starting to make amends. It gives us a beautiful example of what it means to do the work of repair, to change our ways of being that is so necessary so necessary for living into equity and inclusion. The speaker in that song, they start from a place of such despair and shame and self-doubt. I've done so many things wrong, they confess. I've done so many things wrong that I don't know if I can do right. But they're not content to stay there. They don't want to continue living a life that is characterized by their mistakes and brokenness and the ruptures that they've created in their past relationships. Whether it's because of a new love or a new endeavor, the speaker in that song, they find the inspiration and the hope to work towards a better future, to make repairs for what they've done, and to do better moving forward. At this point in my life, they say, at this point in my life, I'd like to live as if only love mattered and as if redemption was in sight, as if only love mattered and redemption was in sight. At the same time, the speaker in that song, they don't ignore their past mistakes. They don't pretend like they're faultless. They actually do the opposite. They're upfront about their mistakes. Before we talk commitment, they say, let me tell you of my past and all I've seen and all I've done, the things that I regret, the things that I regret. The speaker, they don't promise that moving forward they're going to get it right all the time, that they're going to be perfect. Remember, they're still so worried that they don't know if they can do right. But they tell whoever it is that they're addressing, if you give me a chance, if you give me a chance, I'll try. I'll try my best, they say. I'll reach inside and give you all the sweetness that I have, they say. I'll do my best to focus on your needs and how to do right by you, which is all to say that I will love you. I will love you not in word, but in deed. Where you go, I will go. What you need, I'll do my best to provide. What I mess up, what I break, I will do my very best to repair. And I will do all of that. I will do all of that, not to make myself feel better, but because, as our 8th principle reminds us, it is only through the work of confession and repair that we can journey together towards spiritual wholeness. Towards spiritual wholeness. And so, dear ones, at this point in our life, at this point in our collective life together, may we, both individually and as a community, may we have the integrity to live into our promises, the humility to acknowledge our past mistakes and our mistakes in the present, the compassion to listen when others call us back to living into our deepest values, and the love and the commitment and the dedication that we need to work together towards making amends for our shortcomings as a community, as we journey toward and do our part to build a world and a church where there is always more equity, more inclusion, and more spiritual wholeness. May this be so. May all of this be so, and amen.